Hello, class, and welcome to today's lecture on Introduction to Social Psychology. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and I will be guiding you through this foundational topic as we explore the key concepts and theories and history that have shaped the field of social psychology. Now, social psychology is the scientific study of how individuals think, feel, and behave in social contexts. It is an interdisciplinary field, sitting really at the crossroads of psychology and sociology, and it really offers some crucial insights into human interaction, group behavior, and societal influences. And in this course, we will address some of the most intriguing questions that arise in social psychology. Why people conform to group norms. How do our attitudes shape our behavior? What motivates us to help or harm others? And so within this lecture, I hope that you find it fascinating, the overall theme of looking at the foundation for understanding social psychology. Now, in today's lecture, we're going to cover three main themes. The first one is social influence, and this really encompasses the ways in which people are affected by others, whether through persuasion, conformity, obedience, or even subtle cues in their environment. We'll explore some classical experiments and see how the power of social forces really shape our actions and our decisions. We'll then dive into social cognition, and that really kind of refers to how we think or interpret and understand social interactions. And this includes processes like perception and memory and judgment in social contexts. We'll look at how biases and heuristics influence our understanding of the world and lead to cognitive shortcuts that can sometimes result in stereotyping or errors in judgment. And finally, we'll explore social relationships and group dynamics. And in that, we're really looking at human behavior at its deep roots of how we interact with others. How we make friendships, how we make romantic relationships, and at large scales, how we feel like we fit into a group. So here we're looking at concepts like group behavior and what roles do we play in a group and social identity. What does it mean to be in a group versus outside of a group? And what kind of relationships kind of impact us? So those are some things that we'll be looking at in today's lecture. Now, I always want to start my lectures with a little story about someone important in the field. And one such figure is William James, who was a pioneering psychologist and philosopher who worked in the late 19th and early 20th century, and really kind of had a profound influence on psychology as a whole, and indirectly, although he predates the birth of social psychology, impacts the direction that social psychology ended up going. Now, William James was born in New York in 1842 and was widely regarded as one of the most influential American philosophers and psychologists. His interests spanned a wide range of fields, from understanding consciousness and emotion and self-concept to what does it mean to just have a joke. And James really was interested in these areas, and so by extension ends up moving into the realm of what we now call social psychology, with theories like the theory of the self. And so he distinguished between the psychological concept of I and me. So the idea for him is that an I is the part of the self that experiences and acts, while the me is the social self, the version of the self that is constructed through interactions with others. So there's an idea that he came up with that we have a social self, which really becomes pivotal in social psychology because it highlights how our identities are shaped not just by internal factors, but by social experiences and the roles we play within society. Now, another concept that James came up with was the theory of emotion. And this is kind of moved later on with later elaboration, so we now call it the James Lang theory. But in principle, this theory says that emotions arise as the result of physiological responses to external events. So, for example, we don't run because we're afraid because we run. Now, while this theory is more directly linked to biological psychology, it also emphasizes the importance of social and environmental stimuli in shaping our emotions, a core idea that we have in social psychology. And James' broader influences in psychology also extend into ideas about pragmatism, which is really a philosophical perspective that focuses on practical consequences and real-world applications. So he had a wide range of areas that he influenced, one of those being the idea of that if we're to understand psychology and the psychology of people, we need to understand and explore self and emotion and human consciousness, and that is going to lead inevitably to the area of social psychology. And so he's a precursor of and influencer of the development of social psychology. Now, one of the first themes that I want to kind of cover today is the idea of social influence, which is really one of the fundamental areas of social psychology. Social influence really kind of refers to the ways in which individuals are affected by others. And this might be intentionally or unintentionally. And they're influenced in their thoughts and in their feelings and in their behavior. And this includes ideas of conformity and obedience and persuasion and peer pressure. So let's start off with conformity, which is essentially the process by which people change their behavior or beliefs in order to align with group norms. And one of the most famous experiments demonstrating conformity was conducted by Solomon Asch in the 1950s. In his experiment, participants were asked to match the length of lines. And despite the correct answer being obvious, many participants conformed to the incorrect answer given by the majority group. And this really highlights how powerful the need to fit in or avoid conflict can be, even when the group's opinions are clearly wrong. And another critical aspect of the social influence is obedience to authority, which has been famously explored by Stanley Milgram's experiments in the 1960s. And Milgram wanted to understand how ordinary people can commit atrocities, such as those witnessed during the Holocaust. And his studies involved participants who believed that they were administering electric shocks to another person under the orders of an authority figure. And the results were really shocking. Most participants continued to administer shocks even when they believed that they were causing extreme pain, simply because an authority figure instructed them to do so. And this research illustrated the whole idea of the power of authority figures in shaping behavior, and has since become one of the most widely discussed findings in social psychology. So beyond conformity and obedience, social influence also involves persuasion, the process of changing someone's attitudes or behaviors through things like communication. Persuasion can be used for positive purposes, such as encouraging healthy behavior, or for more manipulative ends like advertising. Psychologists such as Robert Cialdini have explored how persuasion works through principles such as reciprocity and commitment and social proof. And all of this demonstrates that there's some real complexity of how we are influenced by others in our everyday life. And so really, understanding social influence really helps us explain why people follow trends, why they adhere to social norms, and how powerful authority figures can affect behavior, and how in many ways we are truly sheep. Now, one of the second themes that I wanted to explore is social cognition, which focuses on how people process and store and apply information about others and about social situations. It's about how we think about our social world, how we make sense of other people's behaviors, how we form impressions and navigate complex interactions. And at the core of social cognition is the idea that we are constantly interpreting social information, whether we're aware of it or not. Our perceptions of people and events are really filtered through our own experiences and beliefs and biases, which can influence how we react to and interact with others. One major concept of social cognition is something called attribution theory that we'll explore more as the course goes on. And this theory examines how we explain the causes of behaviors, both our own and others. Now, when something happens, we tend to make attributions to either internal factors such as someone's personality or disposition, or external factors such as situations they're in. For example, if someone cuts us off in traffic, we might attribute their behavior to them being a rude person, an internal attribution, or to them being in a hurry because of an emergency, an external attribution. And this distinction is critical in understanding how we judge others and interpret social events. However, our attributions aren't always accurate. One common bias in social cognition is what we call the fundamental attribution error, which really refers to our tendency to overstate the role of personal characteristics in others' behavior and underestimate the role of situational factors. In other words, we're more likely to blame someone's personality than to consider the context of their actions. Now, for instance, if a colleague is late for a meeting, we might think they are irresponsible without considering that traffic or a personal emergency could be the cause. Another important concept is social categorization, which is the mental process of grouping people into categories based on characteristics such as race and gender or age. Now, while categorization helps us simplify a complex social world, it can lead to stereotyping and prejudice, which can make assumptions about people based on their group membership, for example. And so social psychologists study these mental shortcuts that lead to these biased judgments and discriminatory behavior, even when we don't consciously intend them. And finally, it's about heuristics, which are more cognitive shortcuts that help us to make quick decisions without having to process all of the available information. And while heuristics can be efficient, they can also lead to errors in judgment. So, for example, the availability heuristic refers to our tendency to judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. If we hear a lot about plane crashes in the news, we might overestimate the danger of lying, even though it is statistically much safer than driving. That would be an example of that. Now, a third theme in social relationships is social relationships and group dynamics, which is something that, is obviously very important to all of us because it explores how our interactions with others shape our behavior and the way that we function in groups. And we are herd beings. Humans are inherently social creatures, and the quality of and nature of our relationships can have a profound impact on our psychological well-being and decision-making processes. So first, let's talk about social relationships. And these include our friendships and family ties and romantic partnerships and professional connections. The study of social relationships is, in psychology, really examines why we form relationships, how we maintain them, and the consequences when they break down. And so social psychologists focus on aspects of things like attachment theory, which was something that was pioneered by John Bowlby and later by Mary Ainsworth. And this theory explores how early bonds with caregivers shape our expectations and behaviors in relationships throughout our life. And so we can have secure attachment or anxious attachment and avoidant attachment styles that can influence everything from how we form friendships to how we handle romantic relationships and conflicts. Now, within social relationships, there's also the concept of social exchange theory, which suggests that relationships are based on a cost-benefit analysis. So, people seek to maximize rewards such as, love and support and companionship, and they seek to minimize the costs such as conflict or inequality. And when the balance tips too far towards the cost, the relationship may become strained or really end altogether. Now, let's shift a little bit in this whole general theme of social relationships to group dynamics, which examines how, individuals behave in groups and how group memberships affect individual behavior. And one famous experiment in group dynamics is, of course, Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. Now, in this study, college students were assigned to play the roles of either guards or prisoners in a mock prison setting. And the experiment had to be stopped after only 6 days because the participants took on their roles to such an extreme degree that the guards became abusive and the prisoners became submissive. And this study, while it's controversial, really does highlight the powerful influence of social roles and group dynamics on behavior. And an important concept within group dynamics is the whole idea of social identity theory. Something that was developed by Henry Tafel. And according to this theory, a person's sense of who they are is really shaped by the groups to which that person belongs, such as their nationality and their religion, or even their sports team. And this creates the whole idea of an in-group, the group that you identify with, and an out-group, which is everybody else. And this can lead to group favoritism and competition and even prejudice. And one of the key effects of group dynamics is group polarization, which occurs when people in groups make more extreme decisions or adopt more extreme attitudes than they would individually. For example, a group of like-minded individuals discussing a political issue might end up holding more radical views after the discussion than they did at the start. And lastly, let's consider the whole idea of what we call groupthink, which is a phenomenon where the desire for harmony and conformity within the group leads to some poor decision making. And group members really end up suppressing dissenting opinions, and they fail to critically evaluate alternatives and make decisions based upon perceived consensus. And this can have some disastrous consequences. And, for example, one that always comes up in the literature is the U.S. decision to invade the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. It was a poorly planned decision due to groupthink. Another example of this might be the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Poor idea, underprepared, and that kind of groupthink can go a long ways to getting people into trouble. Now that we've introduced social influence, let's take a closer look at two specific types. First off, conformity, and then obedience. And both of these concepts really kind of explore how a person responds to social pressures. But they do operate in different ways. So let's start off with conformity. And that's really, what is conformity? It is the act of changing your behavior to align with the norms of a group. And so this might occur in subtle ways, such as adopting the fashion or speech pattern of the social circle, or in more pronounced situations like agreeing with a group's decision, even when it goes against your own personal beliefs. And so conformity is driven by two key types of social influence, something called normative influence and informational influence. Now, normative influence occurs when people conform because they want to be liked or accepted by the group. They might publicly go along with the group, even if they privately disagree. And Solomon Asch's famous line, judgment experiment, really kind of demonstrates this, showing how individuals would agree with obviously incorrect group answers just to avoid standing out. And then there's something called informational influence, which happens when people conform because they believe the group has accurate information. And in situations where the right course of action is ambiguous, people often look to others for guidance, assuming the group is going to know better, when in fact they probably don't. Then we can kind of think of, so that's conformity. Now let's take a look at obedience, because, and we've mentioned this already, but obedience is a bit different from conformity. It involves following some direct orders or commands when an authority figure, often even when the constructions conflict with their own personal values or ethics, they're going to follow it. And I've already mentioned Stanley Milgram's research in the 1960s that revealed the extent to which perfectly ordinary people are willing to follow authority, because in his study, the participants would administer what they believed to be painful, even possibly lethal electrical shocks to other people because they were told to do so by an authority figure. And it was just some guy wearing a lab coat. But a lab coat was a powerful symbol. And so Milgram's experiment, while it is disturbing, illustrates the power of authority that can override personal morality. And so people are surprisingly willing to comply with authority, even in situations where it causes harm to others. So both conformity and obedience are fundamental aspects of human behavior. They're influenced by our desire for social acceptance and the need for accurate information and our deference to authority. So when we understand these concepts, it's going to help us to explain not only everyday behaviors of people, but also help us understand, what goes on in history and in troubling times in society, where people might do horrendous things to others just out of social pressure, or because someone that they perceive to have authority told them to do so. And that can be terrifying. Now, let's continue on by taking a look at group dynamics. We already looked at group dynamics. And we'll look more at social roles and group identity within that whole idea of group dynamics, because there are some forces there that shape how we behave in different social situations. And I think you'll find this interesting. So you can first off think of a social role as being that set of behaviors and expectations associated with a particular position within a group or society. So for example, being a student or a parent, a teacher, or a leader all come with specific roles and responsibilities. And these roles provide structure to our social interactions, and they help us to know how to behave in various situations. However, they can also limit our behavior as individuals who feel pressure to act in line with the expectations of their role, even if it goes against their own personal inclinations. Now, one of the most famous studies highlighting the power of the role of social roles is that Stanford prison experiment, where people very quickly turned on taking on the roles of an authoritative, abusive guard or a submissive, emotionally distressed prisoner, even though neither one of them really was. But it just goes to show how powerful social roles are. Then there's the idea of group identity or social identity, and that's the idea of deriving part of your self-esteem from the group that we identify with. So I feel good when my sports team wins because I am identifying with the in-group. I am a winner. And when my sports team does bad, then I feel bad because my sports team, my group, are people that have lost. So there's this idea of the in-group and the out-group, and there's a tendency to have in-group favoritism and to kind of lump the out-group as this kind of amorphous, homogeneous group that is against you. So that's another thing that to be mindful of. And finally, we've mentioned the idea of groupthink. And there are a couple of interesting things within this, and we've talked about it already, so I just want to kind of highlight it. Groupthink occurs when there's a desire for harmony and consensus in a group, and that really suppresses dissenting opinions and critical thinking. One of the most famous being there was a demonstration of President Putin in Russia asking all of his cabinet to vote on support for invading, and everybody just said yes. And one intelligence officer said, "Oh, well, it depends what we think." And then Putin quickly put him back in his place, and then everybody voted, and they said, "Yes, we all support this," which obviously turned out to be a horrible tragedy for both Ukraine and Russia. And so in order to prevent groupthink, something that is often suggested is really just to appoint somebody in the group as a devil's advocate to argue against the tendency of the group so that we can help them to avoid the pitfall of not using good common sense and not being critical and just trying to go along with the group. But then there's the other possibility of group polarization, where you get a bunch of people together that think the same way, and when they think the same way or tend to move in the same direction, then the group's decisions and actions tend to be more extreme than would be an individual's alone, which is another experience that can often happen within group dynamics. So the whole idea of group polarization can have both positive and negative consequences. On the one hand, it can lead to stronger group cohesion and commitment to a cause. On the other, it can push groups toward extreme or even dangerous behavior, such as is seen in radical political groups or extremist movements. So there are a lot of things to consider within this. So that is it for our lecture. I just want to kind of highlight a few things for As we wrap this up, a few key terms. First off, the whole idea of conformity. That's really the process of aligning one's behavior or beliefs with group norms due to a real or even an imagined group pressure. And so, classical example is Solomon Asch's line experiment, where participants conform to an incorrect group consensus. Then there is groupthink. And groupthink is decision-making process where the desire for consensus leads to a lack of critical evaluation and suppression of dissenting opinions. And this often leads to poor decisions. And then finally, there's social identity theory, which is the theory that suggests that people derive a sense of self-esteem and identity from the groups to which they belong. And this leads to things like in-group favoritism and sometimes to out-group discrimination. So if we were to ask the question, what is an example of group polarization? Well, group polarization in this case would be the phenomenon where group decision leads individuals to adopt a more extreme position. So that brings us to the end of today's lecture on the introduction to psychology. I hope that it sparked some real curiosity on how social influence and social cognition and group dynamics shape our everyday life. And I hope that you continue on with this course because there's a lot more to come. You take care, and thank you very much for being a part of this class. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.